Hi everyone, it's James here. Welcome to another video. This video, the idea for it just occurred to me talking to Ian, Tractor Countdown. Check him out if you haven't done already. Great channel, does some really good discussion pieces. He's also a musician, very good songwriter, lots of good music on his channel. I'll put the link up there somewhere. We were having a little chat and it was all about, I just made another video on my Beatles James channel. It was a contest entry. And one of the questions was about overrated albums. And I related the story as to, I got into trouble on the Vinyl Community Facebook page a while back for posting about this album. This is In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson. And I posted a comment to say I thought this album was overrated. And a few people kind of jumped on me. There was one person who jumped on me, and if I don't recall the guy's name, so if you're watching him, I do apologise, but he seemed very upset that I'd called the album overrated. And I was talking to Ian about this on the comments on my other video, and it kind of occurred to me that you know, it might prove an interesting discussion, because what the guy on Facebook was saying, his argument was that to call an album overrated is to kind of be a little bit rude or impolite about the tastes of other people. So how the logic goes is, well, if the album has been rated over the years, as in, you know, lots and lots of people have said that it's a great album, if you come along and say it's overrated, then essentially what you're saying is those people are wrong. The people who have rated the album so highly over the years must be mistaken in your view. So I suppose the more polite version would be to say, well, I personally don't like this album, or I mean, even to say I don't know what the fuss is all about, that's kind of another way of saying it's overrated. So you'd have to make it sort of strictly about your own tastes and say, okay, so the most polite thing you could say would be, I'm sure it's great, but it's just not my cup of tea, which actually I do hear people say all the time on the VC. So my question for this video is, should we avoid saying things are overrated? Is it more good-mannered to say, I'm sure it's great, but it's just not for me? Now, to me, it's more nuanced than that, because, you know, this album is, broadly speaking, for me. I like certain kinds of prog. I do enjoy King Crimson, and you know, to an extent, I enjoy this album. It's not a bad album at all. In fact, it's a good album. I can clearly hear that there's a lot of good, important stuff going on there. So, what did I mean when I said it was overrated? So, I mean, I'm not here to justify that opinion at all. I'm just here to explore the issue. I suppose what I meant was, you have to separate, perhaps, the idea of an album which is well loved for personal reasons. You know, so people might, you know, say this is a great example. I love this record, and one of the main reasons for that is just I heard it when I was a kid. I associate it with you know, wonderful memories of growing up at my parents' house and listening to it and obsessing over it as a child and just getting into the whole mystique of it. However, this album is often viewed as an overrated album. So what my interpretation of that word overrated means is that it's been rated maybe by people who haven't listened to it, or perhaps who haven't listened to it very carefully. You get a kind of snowball effect, and it often starts with you know, reviews. Critics will come out and proclaim an album to be fantastic, you know, and then sales start to pick up, and it becomes an important album by dint of the fact that it's sold God knows how many millions of copies. So at that point, the album enters the public consciousness as something which is universally revered or adored, and it turns into one of those, you know, 1,000 albums to hear before you die. I mean, the proliferation of those books in the last few years just kind of goes to show how far this thing has gone. Albums enter the canon, and they become these very kind of highly regarded albums, which we're all meant to hear. So the implication of that is that we're all meant to like them as well, or, you know, we're all meant to respect them. And in fact, I mean, I do buy into it. You know, I do buy into that to a large extent. You know, a large chunk of my record collection consists of so-called rock classics, the albums that we're all meant to like, the albums that we're all meant to hear. I mean, you can, you know, accuse me of being a very shallow person, but you know, I mean, I love this album, and it's one of the great albums that we're all meant to hear. So my logic is, well, if that's a great album that we're all meant to hear, and I've always loved this album, then maybe there is something to be had from listening to all these other albums which we're all meant to hear. But maybe that's what I mean when you start to get into the realm of saying something is overrated. Possibly what you're talking about. It's almost like a kind of hearsay effect, where, you know, lots of people perhaps haven't listened to the record very carefully, or they've listened to it a couple of times and they just kind of ticked a box somewhere to say, yeah, that's one of the greatest albums ever, I can tick that one off now, I've heard it. So that then perpetuates the whole process. So, you know, albums that become overrated. Band on the Run by Wings, for years and years, everybody has, you know, said that it's one of McCartney's greatest albums. It's the one that you should check out. And has this become overrated? Do we now ignore other McCartney albums? And it's quite interesting, because since I joined the VC, I've just become aware of just how incredibly rated this album is. And you know, this was not a critic's favourite back in the day. It was completely slagged off. And I genuinely had never particularly thought of it as being one of the kind of real top-ranking McCartney albums. I mean, I enjoy it, I like it, it's tuneful, it's got some great tunes on it. I find it, you know, lyrically a bit shallow, maybe. You know, doesn't contain McCartney's greatest lyrical moments. I also think some of Linda's backing vocals are a bit out of tune. Not massively, but a bit. But, you know, I mean, that kind of adds to the record's charm. Personally, I prefer Band on the Run, because I just love the sound of Paul and Denny Laine together. So, you know, this album would not be at the top of my list, but it seemed to be at the top of other people's lists. So, I mean, here's a record that used to be underrated, maybe. Now maybe it's become overrated. But that might be just my opinion. And if I'm going to say here now, well, I think Ram has become a bit overrated, does that mean I'm now insulting the tastes of the people who have said that, no, that is my favourite McCartney album? You know, I mean, who am I to say that is overrating that record? But then again, I can't really say, well, it's just not my cup of tea, because it is my cup of tea. So where do I stand with that? I mean, going back to, I haven't shown that one, the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper. I mean, that is accused of being overrated right across the board, you know. But then, you know, having said that, you can't deny its enormous significance and the way it totally revolutionised pop music back in the 1960s. Has it become overrated since then? Well, I leave that up to you to decide, you know. There are some people who say it's overrated in the sense that, well, Revolver contains maybe better songs, you know, so why are we constantly harping on about Sgt. Pepper? Because it has more cultural relevance, because it ticks more boxes, because it turns up in more books of, you know, 1,000 albums to hear before you die. What is the reason for this album being so massively revered? How much of it is deserved and how much of it is hype, I suppose, is what I'm talking about. I mean, you know, Red by King Crimson. To me, this is a better album than In the Court of the Crimson King. It's recorded better, it has stronger dynamics, it has some really fiery playing. I think the songs are better, it's tighter, I think it's more original, it's more forward-thinking. It's a bit less bogged down in that kind of 60s organ psych kind of vibe. It sort of points the way more to sort of heavy rock and you know, all sorts of things that was happen later. And yet this album is talked about far less than this one, because this one is the big famous King Crimson album, and it's the one that we're all meant to hear before we die, and it's the one with that cover on, and it's the one that everybody talks about. So I suppose, I mean, things being overrated and underrated, it's all kind of part of the same story. Beatles for Sale, you know. Why don't more people talk about this record? People are always talking about Revolver, they're always talking about Sgt. Pepper. Well, Beatles for Sale contains some wonderful songs and is generally a rather underrated album. This is another one a bit like Ram, you know. Animals by Pink Floyd, for years and years it was totally eclipsed by Dark Side of the Moon. Now it actually tops lots of people's lists, the same as Ram does. And to me, Animals has now become an overrated album. I personally don't think it deserves some of the praise which is heaped upon it. I find some of the tracks a bit too long and meandering, a bit baggy, a bit unfocused. I find some of the lyrical concerns to be rather bleak and pessimistic, and they don't quite chime with my outlook. I find some of the singing a bit strident. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a great album and I like it, but am I wrong to say I find that nowadays it gets a bit overrated? Because who am I to cast aspersions on other people's tastes? And in fact, am I doing that when I say things are overrated? Is there a better way that I could express that? And certainly I did get into trouble on Facebook for making comments about this album and maybe phrasing them in a way which wasn't quite so polite. So anyway, I'm throwing it out there. What do you think? Is it slightly rude to call an album overrated?